So, welcome everybody to this workshop. My name is Liz Wheatley, I'm Brand Secretary of Camden Unison and on Unison's NEC, National Executive. And this workshop is on, just in case you didn't move room, when you were meant to, war, fossil fuels and climate, why defence diversification is a key battle for the climate. I'm really aware we're starting a little bit late, so I think we'll just crack on. We've got 3 speakers who will do no more than 10 minutes each, and then therefore we should still have plenty of time for some discussion from the floor as well, points that people want to raise. And we'll start with Khem. Khem, I believe you're from Commonwealth.
Thank you. Yeah, so just to give a quick sense of what I do, I'm a researcher and I work on the military industry and primarily on this question of diversification or conversion. So the idea being to convert production within the military industry to producing different types of goods that are for civilian purposes, often like wind turbines and other forms of renewable energy. So what I want to speak a bit about today is the connection between militarism and the climate crisis, kind of war and fossil fuels aspect of the workshop, and then also why this diversification or conversion process is an essential part of any transition away from the fossil fuel economy, and also in the long-term interests of workers and trade unions. So I'll speak a bit about the history of militarism and the climate crisis, how the US and UK militaries are responding to the climate crisis and kind of what their contribution to the crisis is, and then a bit about why diversification is essential. So I think often this debate is framed in terms of emissions produced by militaries, and that's something that I'm going to come on to. But I think before going into that, it's really important to understand the historic role that imperial militaries have played in producing the fossil fuel economy globally. So if you go back to the 19th century British Empire, military power obviously was fundamental to spreading industrial production based on fossil fuels across the world. I mean, one example of that, Andreas Malm just wrote this essay for Verso about Palestine and fossil fuel empire and about how the British military basically enforced what they call free cotton markets on different parts of the world through military force. So not only were they basically enforcing people to buy products from these fossil fuel industries in Britain and sort of fueling that industrial revolution, but fossil fuels were actually essential to that expansion of military power. It was the use of steam-powered warships that enabled the British military to wage war on the lands of historic Palestine in 1840, to besiege cities, to kill many civilians and also destroy the army of Muhammad Ali at that time. So that kind of use of fossil fuels was fundamental to military power, but also the extension of military power was fundamental to expanding an economy dependent on fossil fuels. And that process, that sort of symbiotic relationship, we see continuing into the 20th century. At the start of the 20th century, there was a transition led by the British Navy from coal to oil as a naval fuel, and that had massive repercussions for the strategy of imperial militaries. It meant that not only did they have an interest in securing oil supplies for oil companies based in their countries and to ensure that those companies could kind of expand their operations and profit, but also for the operations of the militaries themselves. They needed to ensure they had sustained access to oil in order to wage war. And you see how that then became a sort of focus of imperial strategies and one among many causes of imperial warfare over the coming century. I mean, one example is at the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the mandate system, the British Empire, the French, and later the US, they created, the borders of today's Middle East, partly because of the interests of their oil companies. That the British really wanted access to the port of Haifa in historic Palestine because they wanted that to be an oil terminal. So it's kind of fundamental to how wars were fought over the 20th century and going into the 21st century, and how borders were drawn. And militaries have kind of been central to that process. So as the climate crisis then developed, how did the US and the UK military sort of understand that process? Well, I think what's important to note is that basically they weren't unaware of this. It was the US Navy's commissioned research that was really essential to sort of developing climate science in the 1950s and understanding the effects of CO2 on the atmosphere. So it was within the military establishment that there was a high awareness of climate change from a very early moment. But they also understood that their operations were also responsible for emissions. And that meant that if you want to preserve the capacity of, say, the US military or the UK military, you don't want your emissions to be known about because you might have to do something about the scale of your operations and the scale of your infrastructure. So in 1997, with the Kyoto Protocol, the US military lobbied very hard for military emissions to be excluded from UN climate processes, and they're not accounted for within UN climate processes, and there are great organisations here who do a lot of work on that issue. So basically, while those militaries understood the threat of climate change, they didn't want their own contributions to be discovered. And in the present, I think, you know, what we have to understand is both that historic contribution to the climate crisis, but also how, while they're hiding their contribution, both in past and present, that these militaries are not the kind of solutions to the climate crisis they like to present themselves as sort of keepers of peace in an unstable climate change world, but they're really the causes. If you look at military emissions, the US and UK militaries have emitted 430 million tonnes of CO2 since 2015. That's equivalent to total UK emissions from all parts of British society and economy in the year of 2022. 5% of global emissions come from militaries, 3% of emissions of civil aviation, so that's to give you a picture of how significant this contribution is. They're also responsible for massive ecological damage. You have 1,000 military bases held by the US and the UK across the world, and those responsible for toxic waste in people's water supply through the chemicals they use in training exercises. So there's a massive contribution to ecological damage, and that's not even to mention the military industries themselves that supply these militaries, which are themselves carbon intensive and also take up massive public resource and public spending. The British government spends £28 billion a year on procuring military equipment. That's the same as what the Labour Party was proposing as its kind of climate investment for the whole economy before it scrapped it. If you look at the US, the kind of historic Inflation Reduction Act that's meant to be a massive contribution, not really, is 10 years of that is less than 1 year of their Department of Defence budget. So this also takes up massive public resource that could be going elsewhere, and it could be going into green spending. So in a real set of different ways, past and present, you see the US and UK militaries contributing and at the centre of the climate crisis. And really, that's where diversification comes in as thinking about solutions. You can't just decarbonise these military infrastructures and their military operations, because where the emissions come from, fighter jets, warships, there aren't really technological alternatives. There isn't like a zero carbon fighter jet that you can fly. And also to replace a military system like that, it takes decades and billions of investment. So they're basically locked into using these systems for a very long time. So really that kind of raises the fact that the solution to these military contributions to the climate crisis is a reduction of military operations. It's a reduction of military infrastructure and reduction of military spending. And if you do that, you also have to think about the jobs of people who work in military industries at the moment, and what their future would look like if you're kind of shutting down those operations. So diversification is a response to that. It can be anything from companies saying, oh, we're just going to make different things to deal with the reduction in military spending, to proposals like the Lucas Plan in the 1970s, where the Shop Stewards Combine were pushing for workers' control of production and new investment, and to make different types of products rather than components for military aerospace. So there's a whole kind of range of diversification strategies, but what I would argue is that it's an essential climate policy to deal with that transition away from militaries at the scale that we have them at the moment, that are fundamental to the climate crisis, but also to thinking about how reducing the size of the military industry and reducing military power itself is also important to decarbonisation, because it's not just the direct emissions of these militaries, but it's the strategic role that they play in warfare and in underpinning the global fossil fuel economy that needs to be thought about. So worker-led campaigns for diversification can really be at the core of addressing military power and also addressing the climate crisis there.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Yeah, quite right, very interesting, thank you, and delivered in time. So our next speaker we've got is, whoops, just trying to stop my clock, very well on time, is Sam Mason, and people may have come across Sam in the PCS. She's also an active member of CND and is speaking in that capacity here. So over to you, Sam.
Great, thanks Liz. I'm actually Vice Chair of CND and cover the sort of labour movement side specifically in terms of my remit. But yeah, I've always been an active member of CND. Was one of the first campaigns I got involved with in the early 80s, probably like many people, that brought me to activism, both anti-nuclear but also wider environmentalism as well, because obviously nuclear has always posed the most ultimate threat to climate change. You know, if there is a nuclear strike, it will wipe out, it will destroy the environment, not just for a few years, but obviously, you know, for many years to come, and totally destroy millions of lives and food access for billions of people as well. And there's multiple things, and obviously there's also the health risk. I don't think I probably need to go into many of those detailed issues for people here. I think you're likely all aware of that. I think what is really concerning, and I will put my hand up, I'm a little bit ill prepared today because obviously announcements yesterday from Keir Starmer, which is why we shouldn't be so surprised, but going up to Barrow-in-Furness and announcing not only his unshakable commitment to nuclear weapons and Trident renewal, not only has he before announced his unshakable commitment to NATO as well, but also talking about the increase in defence spending as well to 2.5% of GDP, and apparently we had some fiscal rules a few months ago that had to be observed, so we couldn't spend money on climate and the Green Prosperity Fund. Now all of a sudden, I know this, I don't know whether it's since he put his article in the Daily Mail or he said this originally, I must admit I haven't had time to go back and check. I see now it's being caveated a bit with when finances allow, but still I think this is really concerning. We know, and that's the reason why we're all here, we've got a global climate crisis. It's the biggest security threat to human beings and biodiversity and life on Earth. As it is, we've got an enormous job to deal with that. Nuclear weapons, the investment in nuclear weapons, and I always have to check myself when I say this figure, you know, last estimate's around £205 billion, probably more than that. When there's not money to go into the NHS, not money to go into education, not money to go into social care, and of course not money to go into the kind of things that we need to tackle the climate crisis. It's just absolutely astounding. And I think what is more astounding, it's always coveted as well, and you know, Starmer was really emphasising this, is about jobs. You know, we are going to create the economy on these defence sector jobs, and particularly around the new Dreadnought class submarines and so on. I know, thankfully, in Scotland they've got a different view on this, and certainly in the Scottish Parliament, I can't remember which the Scottish MSP it was now. You know, this is the most expensive job creation programme in history. You know, if you're going to invest in workers and jobs, you wouldn't be putting it in just into nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenal. And of course, this is a nuclear weapons system which we don't have control over. It's American technology, so it's not all this stuff about our security. This is about putting a target on our backs in this country as being an aggressor. There is no way you can have a limited nuclear strike. And just to mention as well, some of you will be aware, at Lakenheath in Suffolk, we've got the restationing of nuclear warheads, American nuclear warheads, where there's been no debate about this. And, you know, we just had this discussion about democracy and the National Climate Service discussion, you know, there's absolutely no debate. Where's the debate within our society? Where's there debate with politicians about whether we want nuclear weapons? Most people actually disagree with nuclear weapons. You know, the UK has not signed up to the Weapon Ban Treaty and didn't turn up to the negotiations, no surprise there, none of the nuclear states did. And we are arguably the most volatile time for nuclear strike, not least with what's going on in Gaza, and it's just astonishing that some extreme right of the parliament in Israel was actually talking about using their nuclear weapons on Gaza. I mean, it's just, I think some of them at least had the sense to realise that would impact Israel as well, but it's not just a small strip of land. But it is absolutely astonishing. But I think we also have to be aware, and I know this is not settled debate, because you cannot de-link nuclear weapons from nuclear power. And we have to make sure that's always emphasised. Now, this is not settled in the environmental movement, it's very clearly not settled in the trade union movement. It's not even settled within the anti-nuclear movement. Unfortunately, I think it perhaps would be. There are still some there that think we need nuclear power as well. Now, governments didn't used to like talking about the crossover between the defence and civilian side of nuclear. They do now, they're very brazen about it. The government's nuclear roadmap clearly talks about how they're going to use the development of civilian nuclear power to feed into the defence programme. Now, we should be extremely worried about that. I mean, extremely worried because of these not jobs that we want, but also this links into the whole belligerent and warming up for war that is now happening, and which we're seeing in the South China Seas with the AUKUS project as well. And just to say, the Australian Maritime Trade Union does not agree with building the submarines in Australia, because they think they should be building stuff to address climate change, not to host nuclear weapons. And I think, just in case I'm getting near running out of time, I'd say the other thing, a lot of this technology, and I think it crosses over with the really excellent introduction that Khem gave about the links over to development with the military and fossil fuels, for example. This is what we see happening in nuclear as well. So when you hear a lot of this discussion around small modular reactors and all the rest of it, a lot of that is actually driven by the military agenda, including into space. The incursions now to put nuclear up into space is just quite horrific. But I do remember reading a couple of years ago the American generals were actually insisting on their government to produce more small nuclear reactors, because one of the things that they really suffer in terms of casualties in war is transporting all this oil around the world, because they've got so many bases. And actually what they want to do is build little nuclear reactors all over the place instead, so they don't have to transport all of this. But of course, the other side of this, it all relies on uranium. It means we are building, every nuclear power plant means we are building a weapons factory, and this is something which I've just finished off on. There's a very good quote, not often mentioned, it's in the late C&D pamphlet which we produced last year, but from Tony Benn, who of course was in charge of energy and nuclear power when he was in government, and he was a big champion for nuclear energy, but at the end of his tenure he realised that every power plant was actually about producing plutonium and going into the weapons system, and he said never ever again should we be doing this. We have got a real opportunity now to come out of nuclear in all its guises. It's a declining industry in terms of the power sector side, with nuclear power plants, most of them coming out of service by 2035. Obviously we've got Hinkley Point coming on, which is now extremely overrun. We've got the prospect of another power plant in Suffolk, and so just to make the final point there, that is on the coastline of Suffolk, which is a declining coastline. It's going to be impacted by climate change itself. On the other side of the county, you've got Lake and Heath. I've got a niece who is a nurse at Ipswich General Hospital, right in the middle, and you just think, my God, I hope they're going to have enough iodine in that hospital to deal with potential that it's likely to happen there. Lake and Heath is only 70 miles away from London. It's on our doorstep. So these are not jobs we should be fighting for, and we've got to clearly link all this into the climate agenda and not seeing it as a separate issue. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Just before I bring Suzanne in, she did just tell me about something which Khem was too modest maybe to say, but if you go to common-wealth.org website, you can find his most recent report, which is Less War, Less Warming, a reparative approach to the US and UK military ecological damages, which I'm guessing is where quite a lot of information came from. So if people want to, look at that to get some more information, I suspect it'll be very, very worthwhile to do. So, okay, our final speaker for the introductory part of this session is Suzanne Jeffery, who is a member of the NEU Teachers Union, and of course very active member of the campaign against climate change trade union group. Over to you, Suzanne.
Great, thank you. So I kind of will end up repeating a little bit of what's already been said, and thanks to Khem and Sam. It's a really great introduction and a great start. So just to repeat some of what Khem's already said as my start point, is that fossil fuels and war have been intimately connected from the very beginning, and Khem made that clear, referencing Mark's work and your own work, Khem, as well. I really recommend a read of the report that this has just spoken about. But that whole attempt by Western powers to control and draw the borders and draw the lines of the Middle East in particular is turbocharged once there's an understanding, with particularly in relation to Iran in the first instance, if I'm right, that there's an understanding that oil is going to be a crucial factor to the development of Western capitalism in the 20th century. But then it doesn't stop there. If you look at the flashpoints, for example, in the First World War, if you think about the division of the empires that went and those that were fighting to redivide the areas that were vacated, if you like, from declining empires. The flashpoints of the Cold War, again, often are following the same geopolitical lines, if you like. So in Central America, in South America, if you think about the flashpoints of the Cold War, in Central Asia, in terms of Afghanistan, etc. And then, of course, we've got the beginning of the 21st century ushered in with what, after the end of the Cold War, which was what was called, it isn't anymore, but had at the time was called the American century, the first American century, and was ushered in with the Iraq War, and for those many of us that took to the streets in rightly in opposition to that war, because we could see what the consequences would be, it was a war for oil, and we knew that, and we understood that, and we campaigned and we demonstrated against that. So defining, defending expanding fossil fuels has been a key focus for the military and war, at least for the last 150 years, 100 odd years, as capitalism has developed with that infrastructure of fossil fuels. And it's still very much the case. So I think we're misunderstanding if we don't understand that that's still very much what's happening at this minute in time. I just want to give you one example. So the Western powers maintain a lot of military in different parts of the world. They're particularly keen on maintaining an influence over wherever their previous colonial areas have been. So, for example, in terms of East Africa at this minute in time, there is very large gas fields being discovered off the coast of Mozambique. The British and other Western powers, French military, are very keen to enforce their exploration and support for their oil companies, gas companies, exploring in that region. And the consequences, as we know that they are for everywhere, is impoverishment for the people that live there. It's not about creating development or diversification of the economy or increasing the lives and livelihoods and the standard of living of people there. But essentially, if we take Mozambique for an example, I know it's something that Friends of the Earth have done a lot of campaigning around. You see an incredibly impoverished region, currently with an ISIS insurgency, built on the back of many people supporting that insurgency because of the way that they've been treated, being removed from their land, further impoverished by the oil and gas companies. But you also see the use of the military, Western militaries, to kind of ensure that the Western gas and oil companies are getting what they want in that region. So it continues in some of the places that we can see very visible in the news at this moment in time, but it also continues in other places. So what have been the consequences of that connection between fossil fuels, oil, gas, etc., and war and the military in the last 100 odd years? Well, we're told, if we bring it up to date, and thanks Sam for your contribution, maybe underprepared, but incredibly useful in terms of responding to Starmer's announcements and so on. But we're constantly told, and we have been told throughout the last century, it is about national interests. So we have to do this for national interests, and therefore that will ensure that people in this country are able to, we're told at this minute, keep the lights on. That's what we've been told, isn't it? We have to, this implacable support for arming Israel as it slaughters and destroys people in Palestine. We're told is in order to defend our national interest. We could not possibly move away from that. All kinds of terrible energy consequences will be the result of it to keep the lights on. But the real consequences clearly are a million miles away from that. The real consequences of that those connections have been obscene oil profits for oil and gas companies, for fossil fuel companies over a century and more. It has created the infrastructure that we're all talking about, an over-reliance on an economy based around fossil fuels, and which, when we talk about decarbonisation, that's what we're grappling with at this minute. Well, we've got some answers which are, falling on deaf ears in certain parts of the world, in certain parts of society, I should say. But essentially, that's what we've got. That is what's been created over the last 100 years, an over-reliance on a whole economy based around fossil fuels. And a climate crisis with as yet untold consequences for working class people, but we can see already what the lines of that looks like. How long have I got this?
You've got 3.5-4 minutes.
3 minutes. So I want to try and conclude on the 3 following things. One is I want to talk about nuclear again, because if I just come at it from the other angle in the first instance, because nuclear is very much being pushed as part of the solution to the climate crisis, and I think it's incredibly important to be able to resist that argument within the trade union movement and within the wider climate movement in the way that Sam was speaking about earlier. In terms of the climate, nuclear is not a solution to the climate. The time that it will take to get the nuclear energy online that is required to decarbonise is far too long a timeline in terms of the speed at which we need to move. But crucially, that argument has always pushed the ball down the court in terms of what we could be doing, the kind of energy sources that we could be using, whether that's wind or solar, or reducing our energy use, full stop. And it is intimately tied with war and militarism. I just want to mention this, in the NEU, so I'm going to keep finishing up on TUC and unions and motions and various things like that. A couple of years ago, the GMB put a motion in favour of nuclear power to the TUC. Now, at that time, my own union, NEU, the delegates sat there, and we didn't have a position in the union on nuclear. Why would we? We're an education union. Obviously I know the answer to that question is you should, for all kinds of reasons, but we didn't. So the delegates sat there listening to the debate and were swayed by the debate that somehow nuclear could be part of the answer to the climate crisis. And I remember I was on my phone and texting people I knew. It was like, you've got to get the union to vote against it. This is not the answer to the climate crisis. Plus also, it's about expanding military investment. That's really what this motion is all about. Now, we didn't. We voted for it, unfortunately, in that conference. So we were one of the unions that backed that motion. But after that, we took it back into our own union, and we have now got, the NEU has an anti-nuclear power position in the union for all kinds of reasons that we're talking about today. And I do think that's something we have to think about for every union. Does it have an anti-nuclear position? Is the union having these arguments at every level? I'm not just talking about the national conferences. Secondly, it is a huge waste of resources. As Khem started with, we have to cut back up on the military spending. There's a huge amount of money that's going to be spent. And I think about, what you were just saying there, Sam, about Starmer's going there and going, jobs, to Barrow and Furness. So originally, I'm not from Barrow, I'm from the northeast of England originally. But those kind of communities that were kind of single industry communities lost those single industries. For me, it was steel town in northeast of England as a kid. And those single industries went, Concert in Canada, which is where I grew up, lost its steel industry, 3,000 jobs went, and there's a kind of decimation that comes with that. And it's similar in terms of Byron Fenner's relying on the nuclear power, etc. But you think about jobs. You could write such a different speech. I've come to Byron Fenner's because I know that this area has been decimated, that your health service is on its knees, that you do not have a transport system, so your young people are stuck in their homes and can't find the work unless they can afford to buy a car. We need jobs. We need a transport system that works for this area, etc. So I've been told to finish. We do need to, what's the right word? There are certain unions dominate this debate because they do have members that work in these industries. But we have to challenge that on every level. Not just challenge what they are saying, but also challenge it is these issues matter to us all, not just the workers that work in those industries, not disrespecting the really significant, important concerns of workers who work in those industries. But these issues affect us all, so therefore all of us to debate, discuss, take positions on. No matter what union we're in and what part of the movement we are in, and there is an awful lot to play for because we can already see what the world looks like with an increase in militarism and with an increase in war. It's not a pretty place. It's not a pretty place. I'll stop on that.
Brilliant, thank you, Suzanne. And I mean, yeah, we also have an anti-nuclear position, and it was a really close vote at that TUC Congress. And part of why it was closed was because we had that position. We had an argument in our delegation meetings, we do organise in the energy sector, about what position we should take. So it matters actually that activists take these arguments into their trade unions, because had the NEU voted the other way, actually, I mean, I'm not putting the blame on the NEU because there were some other unions as well, but had 2 or 3 other unions voted the other way, that motion would have been defeated. And it was a really retrograde motion to get passed actually at the TUC, the overarching trade union body, which is why, of course, we're trying to focus on getting, the motions that were mentioned earlier to our unions and onto the TUC. So, okay, because the panel has been really on point, we've got plenty of time now for discussion from people from the floor. Don't waste it. Stick up a hand, ask a question, make a point. And don't be shy. There you go.
I am shy. Try not to be. Yeah.
Sorry, might just be with it if people say union in the name, just so that people have a reference point as well.
I'm Maggie Smith, Unite Community now that I'm retired. I've been living in East Lancashire and West Yorkshire for 30 years or so. 2 interesting things that have happened in terms of military technologies and what we're able to, what sort of leverage we're able to exert from outside really, not from inside Unite and GMB. One was the question of offshoring the propeller making from Rolls-Royce in Bolton-Aldswick 2 or 3 years ago, and we all traipsed there as sort of to join the pickets, the Unite pickets, to try and stop the offshoring in the first instance. Of course, everybody was talking about, oh well, we can just argue for nice new, making wind turbine propellers and so on, and it sort of seemed a pushover. And in the end, there was a big behind-the-scenes deal, and we were completely wind out of ourselves when they said, okay, Rolls-Royce Barnoldswick's now going to be planning not the manufacture, but the computer programming for small modular nuclear reactors for domestic use. And I went up to the COP26 in Glasgow, went to the Unite and GMB symposium, asked a question about it, and they were completely shameless, you know, that it had actually been a memorandum of understanding behind the scenes between 3 or 4 regions of Unite, that this would be just, you know, seeded. Then more recently, during the Israel-Hamas war, Teledyne, which is a factory in outside Bradford, only 15% of its production is for military technologies, and it's something to do, I think, with the drone delivery systems. A real difficulty initially, I think we've got over, what sort of slogans we shouted, because of course the first time we went to pick it, it was shut it down, and we're really split between people who couldn't see the problem with saying shut it down, and others who said, oh no, we shouldn't be actually saying that's people's jobs, you know, it's only 15% of the production. Lot of debate, and then we've come down to shut it down's okay. We should be, you know, it's okay because we are saying shut down the military production. But what I'm saying is it's not easy as an activist that isn't in a workplace, but there's lots of us sort of we're the people who can travel 15, 20 miles, you know, to turn up at something like that and be there. We're not the people on the inside, unfortunately. But the Unite Union is absolutely impenetrable in terms of being able to talk.
Yeah, I'm Sasha Small, I'm the FPU in Unison, working on the fire brigade. So a few things. Firstly, I guess first question to Khem, which is, do you have, or is there available a list of military emissions by country, and also by head of number of armed forces per country, at least for the highest military spenders? I just did a bit of Googling, I can find one, but that would be useful. Secondly, I have a question to everyone really, but I guess specifically to Sam, which is, what's likely to happen at TEC Congress? I know that's not an easy question to answer from an activist perspective, but I remember last year I kind of simply assumed that the military spending thing would come back, and it obviously didn't. So I know there's a motion to UCU Congress for UCU to put forward a motion to change the TEC position, but does anyone have any insight on, you know, what it would take to get that debate at TEC Congress again? And I'm not saying that because, you know, TEC Congress is a bit on anything, but obviously it is a focus for that struggle, particularly given that we did lose the vote narrowly 2 years ago. And then just also on that, I mean, I agree Unite's impenetrable, but I do think, as someone said in an earlier session, the Grassroots Climate Justice Caucus at Unite, which I used to be involved in, is genuinely quite important initiative. So I think any battle around that in Unite really needs to link up with that network. And then lastly, just in the Labour Party, more of a comment. I think we've got to acknowledge, I mean, clearly Keir Starmer, you know, it's very bad, although as Sam said, not surprising. I think we've got to acknowledge that part of the reason why it's possible is because of the lack of progress that was made on this under Corbyn. So, I mean, it is a peculiarity that actually there's a regression on the question of nuclear weapons in the Labour Party under Corbyn, which is that before that, lots of people on the soft left were anti-tribunal. Lots of people on the right used to talk in terms of multilateral disarmament, and actually Corbyn and McDonnell put it in the too hard box. And, you know, and then yes, of course, the right made it into a banner as well, but it's one of many, many things where if we made more progress between 2015 and 2019, I think we would have been in a better position now. So that's not, you know, the general conclusion there is try to find ways to get things out of the too hard box.